When I moved into my quiet suburban neighborhood, I thought I had found peace. The streets were lined with neatly trimmed hedges, families walked their dogs in the evenings, and every house looked like it belonged on the front of a real estate brochure. It was the kind of place where you expected small-town friendliness, the type of community where people waved as you drove by. What I didn't know was that beneath the picture-perfect surface there was an iron fist disguised as a board of volunteers, the HOA. At first, my experience with the HOA seemed harmless. They sent out seasonal newsletters, organized block parties, and occasionally reminded us to keep our lawns tidy. But as time passed, I began to notice a darker undertone. The board wasn't just enforcing rules, they were enforcing control. It wasn't about maintaining beauty, it was about dominance, and I would become their next target. It all started with a letter in my mailbox. Ironically, the very mailbox that was about to cause me thousands of dollars of stress. The envelope had the HOA's official seal stamped across it, and inside was a notice declaring that my mailbox did not meet community standards. At first I laughed. My mailbox was a simple black post with a standard-size box, perfectly functional and in good condition. What could possibly be wrong with it? But as I kept reading, the tone of the letter grew harsher. According to the board, my mailbox was outdated, inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetics, and in violation of Section 14, subsection C of the Covenant Agreement. The penalty? A $1,000 fine. My jaw nearly hit the floor. $1,000 for a mailbox. They gave me 30 days to pay or face additional penalties, including liens against my property. It felt like extortion wrapped in polite legal jargon. At first I considered ignoring it, but I quickly realized that the HOA had teeth. Neighbors whispered stories of homeowners who defied them, people whose houses were suddenly bombarded with complaints about paint colors, trash cans, or fence heights. One family even lost their home after the HOA piled on so many fines they couldn't keep up. I understood then. This wasn't a request. This was a threat. I decided to investigate. Walking around the neighborhood, I noticed something strange. Mailboxes weren't uniform at all. Some were sleek and modern, others old and weathered. A few even had decorative posts shaped like eagles or horses. Mine wasn't the fanciest, but it was far from the worst. So why me? Why now?
The answer became clear at the next HOA meeting.
I attended quietly, sitting in the back as the board members discussed violations. That's when I overheard them. One member, a sharp-tongued woman with perfectly styled hair and a reputation for being the queen of the neighborhood, was openly mocking my mailbox. She said it brought down property values and made the community look cheap. Her solution was to set an example, and that example was me. I walked out of that meeting with fire in my chest. This wasn't about rules, this was about power, and I had been chosen as the scapegoat. They thought I would roll over, pay the fine, and quietly replace my mailbox with one that fit their standards. But they underestimated me. I started small. I researched the HOA bylaws, digging through pages of dry, complicated language. I wanted to see if they had the authority to fine me over something so ridiculous. The deeper I read, the more I found contradictions. The rules were vague, inconsistent, and in some places, flat-out unenforceable. They had written them loosely on purpose, giving themselves power to interpret them however they pleased. That's when the idea formed. If they wanted to play games with me, I would play back, but smarter. Instead of caving to their demands, I would find a way to turn their rules against them. I wasn't just going to fight the fine. I was going to embarrass the HOA so badly they would think twice before targeting anyone again. But to pull it off, I needed patience, strategy, and just the right amount of creativity. Because in this neighborhood, the mailbox war had only just begun. and the HOA had no idea what was coming. The fine sat on my kitchen counter like a threat, waiting to explode. Every time I passed it, I felt my blood boil. $1,000 for a mailbox, not a broken fence, not an overgrown yard, not some dangerous violation, just a mailbox that supposedly didn't match some unwritten vision of community perfection. But instead of letting anger consume me, I let it sharpen me. If the HOA wanted a war over a mailbox, then that's exactly what they were going to get. I started by taking pictures, lots of them. I walked the neighborhood with my phone, snapping photos of every mailbox I could find. Some leaned sideways, others were rusted and peeling. I found one that was half crushed, duct-taped together just enough to keep mail from spilling out. Compared to those, mine looked pristine. The irony was laughable. But these photos weren't just for my amusement, they were ammunition. Proof that the HOA was selectively enforcing its rules. Next, I began researching laws in my state about HOA authority. Many homeowners don't realize that while HOA boards act like they have unlimited power, they are still bound by state property codes. And in my case, I discovered a golden detail. The HOA covenants specifically required uniform enforcement. They couldn't single me out for a violation if they ignored the same violation elsewhere. That gave me leverage. But simply fighting the fine in legal terms wasn't enough. I wanted to make a point so big that the board would regret ever putting my name on their violation list. That's when the plan clicked in my mind. If they claimed my mailbox didn't meet community standards, then I would give them a mailbox that met the standards, in the most outrageous way possible. I went online and searched for custom mailboxes. The possibilities were endless. Mailboxes shaped like animals, cars, even miniature houses. After hours of browsing, I found the perfect one. It was bold, unmistakable, and guaranteed to draw attention. It was a 6-foot-tall, hand-painted replica of a medieval castle turret, complete with faux stonework and a tiny flag at the top. And yes, it had a fully functional mailbox built into the side. It was ridiculous. It was over the top. And most importantly, it was technically compliant with every single HOA regulation. The cost was steep, but compared to a $1,000 fine, it was worth every penny. I placed the order and waited with anticipation. When it finally arrived, delivered on a massive pallet in front of my house, even the delivery driver shook his head in disbelief. Installing it was a challenge, but with the help of a few friends, and more than a few laughs, we secured it right at the edge of my driveway. The next morning, the neighborhood woke up to a sight they would never forget. My new mailbox towered over the street, bold and unmissable. Neighbors stopped in their tracks, some laughing, others snapping photos. Within hours, the gossip spread. My mailbox wasn't just a mailbox, it was a statement. And predictably, the HOA lost its mind. Within 2 days, I received another official notice. This time, the letter was dripping with frustration. The board claimed my new mailbox was unsightly, disruptive, and not in keeping with the aesthetic values of the community. But here's the kicker. They couldn't cite a single bylaw that it actually violated. Every requirement, height, distance from the curb, color, functionality, had been met. I had followed their rules to the letter. They just hadn't expected anyone to take those rules to such an extreme. Instead of panicking, I documented everything. I photographed the mailbox from every angle, measured the dimensions, and cross-referenced them with the HOA's own written guidelines. I even printed out my compliance evidence and mailed it directly to the board, using the castle mailbox, of course. Neighbors started talking. At first, some rolled their eyes, saying I was being petty, but as the HOA continued to push, more people began to see the truth. They remembered their own unfair fines, their own battles with the board's arbitrary decisions. My mailbox became a symbol, not just of defiance, but of resistance against the HOA's abuse of power. The board, however, wasn't ready to back down. They called an emergency meeting specifically to discuss my case. I wasn't required to attend, but I did anyway, sitting quietly in the back, just like before. The energy in the room was different this time. Instead of smug confidence, I could see the tension in their faces. The castle mailbox had made them a laughingstock. The president of the HOA banged his gavel and declared that my mailbox was against the spirit of community harmony. That phrase caught my attention because it wasn't in the bylaws. It was just something they made up on the spot. Other members argued back and forth, some insisting they needed to crack down, others worried they'd face legal trouble if they tried to force me to remove it. For the first time, cracks were forming in their united front. I didn't say a word during that meeting. I didn't need to. My mailbox was speaking louder than I ever could. The next week was chaos. I began receiving supportive notes from neighbors in my mailbox, real ones, written by people who thanked me for standing up to the HOA. A few even confessed they had been too scared to challenge the board, worried about retaliation. My act of defiance gave them courage. The castle mailbox had gone from being a personal protest to a neighborhood symbol. But with every day that passed, the HOA's desperation grew. They threatened new fines, hinted at taking me to court, even tried sending a so-called compliance officer to inspect my property. But each time, I pushed back with evidence, photos, and legal references. They couldn't win without changing the rules entirely, and that was a process that would take months, maybe years. And while they scrambled to regain control, I was already preparing my next move, because I knew the battle wasn't over. The HOA hated being humiliated, and they would stop at nothing to crush what they saw as rebellion. But I had something they didn't: the support of my neighbors, a flawless paper trail, and the confidence that comes from knowing you're right. The castle mailbox was only the beginning, and soon the HOA would learn that I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was about to force them to rewrite the very rules they had used to control us all. The castle mailbox stood tall at the edge of my driveway, but by now it had grown into something much bigger than a joke or a protest. It had become a battleground between one homeowner and an entire board that thought it was untouchable. Every time I walked past it, I felt a surge of pride, not just because it was ridiculous and impossible to ignore, but because it represented the one thing the HOA hated most: someone refusing to bow down. But the board wasn't finished with me. Not even close. The letters kept coming. First, they accused me of lowering property values. Then, they claimed my mailbox was a distraction to drivers. After that, they said it violated community harmony. Each notice was more desperate than the last, and none of them cited actual bylaws. They were trying to intimidate me into submission, hoping that endless pressure would break me down. It didn't work. Instead, I doubled down. I kept meticulous records, saving every letter, every email, every so-called violation notice. I filed them neatly into a binder that was growing thicker by the week. And I wasn't the only one paying attention anymore. Neighbors were watching too, some quietly, some openly cheering me on. My mailbox had turned into the talk of the entire community. Children posed in front of it for pictures. Families walking their dogs stopped to admire it. People slowed their cars just to get a better look. And with each smile, each laugh, each supportive word, the HOA's authority weakened. They weren't the protectors of the neighborhood anymore. They were the bullies trying to silence the fun. Things escalated when the HOA scheduled a special violation hearing. This was their big move. They wanted me to stand before the board while they read their list of complaints, then force me into compliance. But what they didn't realize was that I wasn't walking into their hearing unprepared. I walked in carrying that massive binder, overflowing with photos, documents, and proof of selective enforcement. The hearing started like a performance. The board members sat at their long table, papers neatly stacked, acting like judges presiding over a trial. They listed my supposed offenses one by one, repeating the same baseless claims I'd seen in their letters. But when it was my turn, I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply laid the binder on the table and slid it toward them. Inside were dozens of photographs of other mailboxes far worse than mine had ever been. I highlighted bylaws that directly contradicted their complaints. I pointed out the requirement for uniform enforcement and showed exactly how they had targeted me while ignoring others. And then I added the final touch. A stack of written statements from neighbors, people who openly supported my mailbox and were tired of the HOA's bullying tactics. For the first time, the board went silent. They weren't expecting resistance this strong. They weren't expecting proof, evidence, and community backing. They had expected a homeowner too scared to fight back. By the end of that meeting, they didn't fine me. They didn't order me to remove the mailbox. All they did was glare and say the matter would be reviewed further. That was the moment I knew I had won. Not the war yet, but the battle. Word spread quickly after the hearing. Neighbors started approaching me, telling me their own horror stories. One had been fined for leaving his trash cans out a few hours too long. Another had been forced to repaint her house because the shade of beige was too warm. These weren't community standards. These were power games, and people were finally starting to see it. The mailbox had become a rallying point. Within weeks, more and more homeowners began showing up at HOA meetings. They asked questions. They demanded explanations. They challenged the board's decisions. What had once been a group of silent, intimidated neighbors was turning into a crowd that wasn't afraid to push back. The board tried to fight it. They threatened lawsuits, hinted at raising fees, even whispered rumors about me being a troublemaker. But the harder they pushed, the more people sided with me. The neighborhood wasn't buying their scare tactics anymore. Eventually, the breaking point came. At the annual community meeting, the HOA board unveiled their new proposed regulations, and at the very top of the list was a section titled Mailbox Standards. It was clear as day. They were rewriting the rules, specifying sizes, materials, colors, and designs. Everything down to the smallest detail was listed, leaving no room for castle mailboxes or anything else they couldn't control. On paper, it looked like a victory for them, but in reality, it was proof of my victory. They had been forced to admit their old rules were too vague, too weak, too exploitable. My protest had exposed their abuse of power, and the only way they could fix it was to start from scratch. As they read the new rules aloud, I couldn't help but smile. They had tried to fine me into silence. Instead, they had to rewrite their entire system because of one homeowner who refused to back down. In the months that followed, the neighborhood felt different. The HOA was still there, still trying to enforce its new rules, but the fear was gone. People spoke up more, questioned decisions more, and reminded the board that they worked for us, not the other way around. And every time I walked past my driveway, my mailbox still standing tall, I remembered the lesson that had come from all of this. The HOA had fined me $1,000 for a mailbox. But in the end, I gave them something they'd never forget. A fight they couldn't win. A rulebook they had to rewrite. And a reminder that sometimes the smallest act of defiance can topple the tallest tower of control. Because in this neighborhood, a mailbox wasn't just a mailbox anymore. It was a monument.